Hello and welcome to this new episode of AFRICAFE. I am today happy to be joined by Ambassador Peter Pham, who is the Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, who is also a former United States Special Envoy for the Sahel region. Dear Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you.
With the 2024 elections approaching, U.S. foreign policy toward Africa is at a pivotal crossroads. The evolving political landscape in the United States of America will definitely influence trade, security, and climate initiatives all across the continent. And we want today to anticipate how future U.S. leadership will influence its engagements for each candidate toward the continent. We want to talk first about policy priorities toward Africa. The U.S. has historically provided significant aid to African economies and countries, but the nature of this aid might vary depending on the administration in power. So what specific foreign policy challenges do you expect from the potential candidates in 2024, and how might these impact African economies?
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. As I've written in the past and spoken about, there's great continuity in U.S. policy towards Africa. In fact, although there's stark contrast this year in particular between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, the newly substituted Democratic candidate for the presidency, replacing President Joe Biden. Though they're very, very different people, very, very different policies, traditionally, Africa policy has had great continuity between administrations, both Democratic and Republican. It's something I wrote about for the Policy Center for the New South several years ago, this plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose attitude. For example, the largest trade preference program for Africa, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, originated in a bipartisan initiative during the Clinton administration, was renewed and expanded under President George W. Bush, renewed once again under President Barack Obama, and we anticipate next year, irrespective of the winner of the November election, will be renewed in some form. Now, we can return to that in a minute. Otherwise, in other areas, likewise, a lot of continuity in policy. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the most recent and arguably the largest change in development assistance to Africa and other countries in the global south, a $60 billion program, was passed into law and signed by President Trump in 2018 and continues to operate. So there's continuity, but there's no denying there may and will be some significant changes. And one of them will be the fact that next year, the AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, the trade preference scheme for sub-Saharan African countries, is up for renewal. And one will expect that there's a number of questions that will be raised about the eligibility of a number of countries for renewal, given their foreign policies.
So we understand that there is a continuity of the U.S. foreign policy toward Africa when it comes to aid for support African economies and addressing, of course, its present challenges. My second question would be about climate financing. There are some major differences between the two candidates, between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Africa is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, as you know, and yet it often receives not necessarily or inadequate support for climate resilience and adaptation. How do you think U.S. approach to climate financing of African nations would be affected by the outcome of the U.S. elections, particularly regarding initiatives like the Green Climate Fund?
Well, I'm not a mind reader, nor do I speak for either of the two candidates, but I would suspect that although there's recognition that Africa has not contributed as much as other regions and industrialized countries to climate change, it disproportionately is impacted by it. And furthermore, that climate adaptation, especially the energy transition, cannot occur without Africa. The minerals involved, the carbon sequestration that occurs in areas like the Congo Basin. So there's a recognition of Africa's importance in that. That being said, however, I do think that there is going to be a shift perhaps more radical if President Trump is reelected than if Vice President Harris takes office. But I do think there is going to be a shift away from multilateral financing mechanisms. The reason being is, quite frankly, speaking as an American taxpayer as well as a public engagement person, the United States does not get its due, and its interests are not well served by multilateral mechanisms like this. We are often a major contributor to them, but we don't get the recognition or the say in the governance. Although it was the Obama administration that signed up, for example, for the green finance mechanism, under the Biden administration, financing for renewable energies has largely occurred on a bilateral basis. And for example, the recent approval by the U.S. Export-Import Bank, EXIM, financing to the tune of $900 million for a 2,000 megawatt renewable solar project in Angola, which will export energy to the Democratic Republic of Congo and other countries. That's occurring on a bilateral basis rather than a multilateral basis. I expect that this trend, which occurs even in the Biden-Harris administration, will certainly be accelerated in a Trump administration.
Perfect. I want to move on to the United States' interest in Africa and the rise in major powers, like if we could say so, and it's specifically when it comes to Russia and China and their increasing influence on the continent. China and Russia have been increasing their influence through investments, military partnerships, and diplomatic engagements. And with the U.S. aiming to maintain its presence on the continent, it's important to explore how the election results might shape strategies to counter these growing powers. So, given the increasing influence of both countries, how might the U.S. 2024 elections reshape the U.S. strategy to counterbalance these presence of the two countries in the continent?
Well, thank you. I think we have to disaggregate the different powers when we talk about great power competition in Africa. On one hand, you have China, which has sustained over a long period engagement in Africa on the economic front. Less so in assistance, but more in terms of some investments and certainly in terms of commerce and trade and loans and debts which have acquired, although that has decreased. Even at the recent Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, although new financing was announced, it's still at a level that's not even half of what it was 10 years ago. So it is decreasing, but it's a sustained engagement. Compare that to Russia's engagement, one can call it engagement in Africa, which has been largely opportunistic, looking for vacuums that occur and chances of going in where either Western countries have been pushed out or are reluctant because of coups and extra-constitutional changes of government. But there are limits to Russia's abilities. The recent in Mali, for example, at the end of July, the humiliating ambush of Russian mercenaries, the deaths of dozens of Russian mercenaries, including some veterans of conflicts throughout Africa and the Middle East, as well as Ukraine, are losses that underscore perhaps the lack of capacity to sustain over a long term. Now, how will the elections impact this? I served in the Trump administration, as you mentioned, as the special envoy for the Sahel. And at the time, we had the first coup in Mali. Yet, despite the fact that we were very quick to condemn the coup, suspend military assistance, because that's required under U.S. law, we continue to engage constructively with those that took power. And in fact, in my time as special envoy, there were no Russian mercenaries. We maintained a pragmatic approach. The Biden-Harris administration has been perhaps a little more doctrinaire, but the result has been not only a rupture in a lot of ties with Mali, but the expulsion of U.S. military personnel and bases from Niger. So I'm not sure about the efficacy of that policy. So I think there will be a contrast. I think a Trump presidency may be more pragmatic in its dealing with security. Remember, it was under President Trump that even Morocco joined the Abraham Accords, and our cooperation reached a very high level. So we'll see what happens, but I do think that this is one area where there is a difference in both tone and substance.
Speaking about your own experiences, especially the former envoy for the Sahel region, I want to go back to security cooperation with Africa. How do you expect the outcomes of the 2024 elections influence U.S. security cooperation with African nations, particularly in areas where counterterrorism and regional stability is being challenged?
Well, I think this is another area where there has been, until recently, continuity in U.S. policy of engaging, seeking to build partnerships over the long term, and being pragmatic in building those partnerships with African partners and working with key regional states who are longtime allies, major non-NATO allies like Morocco, engagement with countries like Ethiopia in East Africa. There's been a little bit of a bumpy road in the last few years in the Biden-Harris administration. So I think this is another example where we will see the results of the election will impact policy. But I think it's important for the U.S. to look at the long term. Yes, there will be bumps in the road, but the key is that long-term security is the basis from which one can have development and prosperity, which is shared by everyone. And the key to that is also working with countries in the region that have an even greater stake in that stability and prosperity than we do ourselves.
Dear Ambassador, thank you very much for sharing all this reflection about the U.S. 2024 elections and its impacts for Africa. Thank you very much for your valuable insights. To our audience, thank you for following us and join us, and stay tuned for more thought-provoking discussions with some special hosts. Thank you very much, dear Ambassador, for following us today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.